Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan, and joining me today for our discussion is Nish Acharya, the former Director for Entrepreneurship and Innovation and a former Senior Advisor to the US Commerce Secretary, somebody who served in the Obama administration and of course is now a private citizen. Welcome to the show, Nish. It's
Thank you very
have
much. Pleasure to be here.
Your book,
Yes.
The $1 trillion Partnership, which came out last year and of course is still being discussed, being circulated, posits a hugely ambitious,
Yes.
kind of agenda
Right.
for the economic partnership, right?
Right.
The $1 trillion is the goal for bilateral trade by 2030. I can understand when you were writing the book, the enthusiasm which obviously propelled you to do that.
Right.
But based on what you've seen happen in the Indian economy itself and on the bilateral front,
Yeah.
how realistic a goal, given a chance, would you rather say $1 trillion by 2040, or do you think 2030 is still a target that could be reached?
So it was not meant to be a hard target.
Right.
I think the reason, and I did this with Gateway House, a think tank in Mumbai, the reason we set the $1 trillion mark was more to say, if you ask yourself, what should the relationship between the second and third largest economies in the world be? It should be closer to $1 trillion than 500 billion, which is the number that's often thrown around by politicians.
Right. And just so that our viewers can get a sense of these numbers,
Yeah.
the current state of play is around 120.
120 billion is 2013.
Yeah.
And so $1 trillion is very ambitious under that scale.
Yeah.
But if you look at the U.S.-China, the U.S.-Mexico, those relationships, they're slated to be at $3 trillion by 2030. So why are we, as U.S. and India, settling at 500 billion?
Right.
So the first, it's really a question is, it should be at $1 trillion because that's where other nations of similar size are with the United States. And if that's the case, how do we actually get on a path to do that? Now, realities, of course, get in the way of that, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about the relationship in a much more ambitious and strategic way than we are.
Right. But to get to $1 trillion by 2030
Right.
requires a certain focus
Yes.
by both governments, of course, but especially by the government of India, you would argue, because a lot of economic activity in India is still centered around decisions or policies that governments at the central and the state levels take to a much greater extent than in the US. Based on what you've seen over the last year since you wrote the book, or since when the book came out, how optimistic are you about the direction in which things are going and the speed?
So I think we have to separate it out. I think I'm still fairly optimistic. And the reason is I've actually identified, in terms of U.S. engagement in India, 4 different themes around which we could get engaged. One is around some of these more complex, large issues like infrastructure, energy, healthcare, but others are around helping in the development sector, NGOs, philanthropy, also around building India's startup culture outside of Bangalore, Delhi, into the other 52 cities with over 1 million people, and then looking at next generation technology. And on most of those, actually, government isn't really the driver. It's going to be private investment, private sector leadership, NGO leadership, those sorts of things. So I would say while the government policy side on both sides has been short of what we would expect and what we need from a policy framework, I think you're seeing so much investment in the Indian startup sector. I think you're seeing a growing investment philanthropically from the U.S. So I think those are very positive signs. You know, what I tried to say in the book was that we've seen this transformation once before in the 90s with the outsourcing revolution, where America had a clear need and India had a clear solution for that need. And I think what we need to do if we're going to get to $1 trillion is say, what's the next outsourcing? What are the next series of technologies, businesses, innovations that can jumpstart FDI in India by 40x, which is what happened last time? And what are the technologies where America particularly can be useful? And I think this is important because I think there's some things where Europe or Japan or China may be better partnership for India. But there's certain things where the United States is going to be key. And I think those are development, innovation, entrepreneurship, systems thinking, scale up, those sorts of things. So I think the government not passing GST, the government not embracing some of the ideas put forward in the Obama Modi are certainly disappointing. But politics is politics. You can't rush that. What you can do is focus on where where the FDI is coming in, where the engagement is coming, and what can we do to find real solutions there.
Right. Unlike other major partners of India like Japan or China, where the prime ministerial visit or visits that he made in 2015 actually led to hard numbers being put on the table, right?
Yes.
So in Japan, Abe-san said there would be $35 billion worth of Japanese investments. The Chinese also had a figure running into, I think, $20 billion.
Right.
The US visit didn't produce anything comparable.
Right.
The Prime Minister met with CEOs. He has also had a successful visit to Silicon Valley where he interacted with key technology leaders in the US.
Right.
But we're still not seeing those big announcements. I mean, Foxconn talks about $10 billion, but that's again, Asia to Asia.
Right.
Nothing really seems to have, there's no big ticket move on the horizon other than a lot of goodwill, other than a lot of intentions being declared.
Right.
Where's the catch? Where's the problem?
So I would say two things. One is most of those announcements that are made, and this is true for any nation in the world, hardly half of it ever actually happens. And I think the U.S. has learned its lesson on that front. And so America tends not to make those grandiose announcements of investment anymore. It just doesn't do it. And in the Indian case, actually, you're seeing an immense amount of FDI. I don't know the latest numbers, but private capital from the United States entering India. And so that's often been the U.S. outlook is, look, our official assistance or our official package is X, but really if you look at private investment, remittances, aid, philanthropy, all of that, it's huge. And so U.S. has always been the leader in that. So I think those announcements are nice politically, but I don't think they're as relevant as the entire picture. And I would also say on that front, I think, well, let's leave it at that.
Yeah. I guess because the reality is even in Japan, it's the state cannot direct private business to do things. But what they do is that, for example, if you look at the bullet train project, which of course many people have questioned the wisdom of this, but the Japanese say, well, here's the financing, here's the technology, and you're talking about a 30-year loan at less than 0.5% interest rate, right? So that in a way facilitates a lot of the B2B transactions, which which then subsequently take place, maybe not on the same scale as which.
And on that front, I think America is just not in the position to do much. I mean, our own infrastructure in the United States is suffering. We haven't been able to pass an infrastructure bill and a transportation bill in the United States to fix our roads and trains and bridges. So I think part of the hesitation is we don't have a business model for our own infrastructure, and so we haven't been able to extend that to other nations, which is unfortunate. That's something we need to get better about.
Right. In a recent piece you wrote, you gave a grade of B+ to the performance of the government over the last year. That may seem unduly harsh to many people, but that's your view. What are the reasons for that grade, which some may consider reasonable in a year and a half? Others may perhaps not consider that so good. But what, in your view, needs to be done to push that grade up from B+ to, say, A- or even A?
Sure. So the reason I think a B+ is actually a very good grade, given the tough political environment in which Prime Minister Modi works. And so I think B+ is good. The reason I gave that is I think too many announcements were made about big programs without much substance behind it. And now there's been a game of catch-up to start substantially filling those programs. So you had Swachh Bharat, you had financial accounts, bank accounts for everybody.
Jan Dhan,
you had Make in India, you have Startup India, you have all these things coming out, Stand Up, all of these things. And so, I mean, these are tough problems, tough challenges. Just one is very difficult to address. And yet the Prime Minister announced multiple initiatives. And then, of course, he had battles to fight on land reform, GST, other things. And
but these are all initiatives intended to tackle different aspects of the problem, right? So
they are, but look how big the problems are. I mean, these are massive problems. And
I mean, he would argue that if I don't have a multi-pronged strategy, then I'm not going to succeed.
No, I understand that, and that's why. But I think it's too much to take on in such a complex country as India, where certainly more resources are available now, but these are big, tough problems, and even one is a lot to handle, I think.
I want to ask you about Make in India, and the kind of difficulty which, I mean, apart from the feasibility of a country like India coming to the global manufacturing game fairly late in the day, at a time when many manufacturing nations are moving out of it for a variety of reasons. One of the areas of concern that certainly is reflected in the data that we've seen over the last 3-4 years is that industries which are so the manufacturing sector, right, companies, job creation has been a big problem there.
Yes.
Right? Far from companies in the manufacturing sector actually creating jobs, the data suggests that jobs actually are being destroyed at a faster rate than they're being created. To that extent, is some of the emphasis on Make in India misplaced from at least an employment generation point of view? I mean, you've advised the Obama administration on entrepreneurship and on innovation. But these aren't areas, I mean, innovation is not an area that's going to absorb lakhs and lakhs of people. So the employment quandary
is real.
Jobless growth, which the rest of the world has been confronting for the last 2 decades, seems to have hit home here with a vengeance.
So this is a real tension, and there's more economists who are skilled in this than I am. But large-scale manufacturing seems to be the strategy that the majority of economists believe is the way forward for any country. At the same time, advanced manufacturing, when you hear Boeing is building a factory, it's just this challenge, and it's more robots than it is people.
Exactly.
And so that's not going to create
a lot of
jobs.
Automotive manufacturing.
Exactly.
Similarly.
Exactly. One of the things I suggested in the book was that India needs to take a very probably have 1,000 flowers bloom in manufacturing. And so that needs to be everything from, upgrading hand looms and handicrafts from handmade to one level up, machine-oriented, but also at the other end have a strategy for something as advanced as 3D printing, where if you can produce, you don't need a big infrastructure, you can do it small scale at a village level, use local materials. And a Make in India strategy can't just be for the Boeings or the Reliances. It has to be everything from next generation technology and 3D printing all the way to improving the efficiency of handicraft makers, which is the second largest industry in India, actually. And so it's got to be much more broad-based than it's been so far.
Right. The Prime Minister's initiative for Stand Up India, which is aimed at, in a way, creating these 1,000 flowers, entrepreneurship in sections of the population that have traditionally not had access to those avenues of betterment. Now, the US has successfully run for 4 or 5 decades affirmative action, even at the entrepreneurship level, at various to various extent. I mean, in the sense that, for example, you may have some states may have a rule that contracts will go to those businesses which are minority owned or which have. How successful has that been in the US in creating entrepreneurship or enlarging the so-called middle class among minority groups? And I don't mean the Indians because they're already perhaps overrepresented, but say African Americans or Latinos. How successful have those initiatives been in the US? Because certainly some may say there's a lot for India to learn from.
So, affirmative action programs are obviously complex. In the United States, overall, it has had a hugely positive impact. Over 60% of African Americans now are in the middle class. That's a huge jump from before affirmative action programs began, and that's been in business, education, all sorts of things. So overall, the programs have been tremendously successful. On the issue of entrepreneurship, the challenge for government is that government is not very good at failure, politically or operationally, and entrepreneurship is defined by high rates of failure. And so it's important, I think, for the government to say, Indian government to say, that we are going to make more capital available to new entrepreneurs. We're going to make sure that underrepresented communities have a chance to bid on municipal, corporation, state, and central government contracts. All of that's going to be important. I think what government cannot do is absorb the risk of business inherently. And that's where I think private philanthropy and companies need to step up. And so I had the fortunate experience to work in Hubli, Karnataka for many years in a previous job. And in there's no big company. It's somewhat isolated. Philanthropy has to step in and say, we're going to invest in startups. We're going to take some risk in terms of training these entrepreneurs.
So sort of social investment in a way.
Social investment, but in the end to lead to for-profit entrepreneurship. So you need to train the entrepreneur. You need to give them a little bit more high-risk capital. And ultimately, your first 100 may fail, but the next 100 may be successful. And so I think government needs to provide, make sure the playing field is straight and provide tools where possible. But then I think it's a very good space for companies and philanthropy to play as well.
Well, and Nikhil, I don't think that the amount of failure or the quantitative or the cumulative failures of, say, 1,000 Dalit entrepreneurs created through Startup India would even begin to approach the risk that we've ended up carrying for one Vijay Mallya, for example, who's defaulted to such a large extent. So.
The problem, though, is that if you have 1,000 failures, that's the first thing the opposition politicians will ask. That's the first thing the media asks. And it's a very uncomfortable position. And we had that problem in the United States, in the middle of the country, New Orleans, Cleveland, Detroit, we're trying to transform these cities into entrepreneurial hubs. And it's a very big challenge. People say, why is everything failing? Why are we not seeing startups? And it's going to take 20 years. And I think the same is true in India.
If I can turn to one sector where, which is the nuclear energy, right, which in many ways has been the political or, shall we say, strategic locomotive that has driven this relationship over the last decade, right? Ever since the July 18th, 2005 Bush-Manmohan statement. However, on the ground, right, it's been more than 11 years, or coming up to 11 years now. On the ground, some may say that nothing much has moved. GE and Westinghouse, who are the main or the only American nuclear vendors, do not appear to be any closer to setting up nuclear plants. To your mind, are these sort of bottlenecks that were inevitable given the complexity of the nuclear industry and all the kind of regulatory issues? Liability, for example, held things up for a long time. I still believe it's not a bridge they've crossed, although the government say they have. And to what extent has this generated, has it generated frustration among American entrepreneurs or American companies, or do they understand that, look, well, nuclear is sui generis, you can't really compare what's happening there with other sectors?
So I think to your latter point, there is an understanding that nuclear energy in particular is probably the most complex relationship in terms of bilateral trade and investment and collaboration to do. And so I think there's an understanding that it was the most difficult thing. It was also chosen really, as you were mentioning earlier, to really jumpstart the relationship and put it on a different footing. And so that is true. I think what I've suggested is for the India and US to move forward to this $1 trillion goal, maybe we don't try the hardest things in the world. Maybe there's a lot we can do around innovation in healthcare, in energy, in agriculture, areas where India needs huge improvement, huge investment, huge IP and new innovation, and aren't nearly as hard as the nuclear deal was. And so there's a huge value in the nuclear deal politically, geopolitically, and ultimately in India. But I think if you were to look at it and say, what else could we have done in those 10 years, all things being equal, I think there's a lot of other sectors where American experience and know-how, such as agriculture, where India needs to really boost its food supply, could have been tremendous and could have been engaged a lot earlier. Now, obviously, that's hindsight. We don't know, but
I can see how American capital, finance, and technology in a wide range of sectors, right, can be of enormous help if these are harnessed properly. The danger in thinking of a partnership which embraces more than these three elements is that the underlying political and social realities of the two countries are really different, right? For example, healthcare. If India were to start emulating or looking at the non-existent US model of public healthcare, which we seem to be, in my view, in danger of doing because there's a sort of increased emphasis on private insurance or on government subsidizing insurance. But in other words, looking at insurance as the route rather than public investments. How mindful do policymakers need to be of this very, very important difference between the two countries? Yeah,
I think they have to be very mindful. I think the issue in India is, you could take the British model, which is government, or you could take the private US model. In India, the political climate, it seems to favor the private model, whether or not it's the better model, right? And so that's the challenge. I think I have two cases in the book, Public Health Foundation of India and Vatsalya Hospitals, where I talk about, the advantage of the American healthcare system is operationally helping build the infrastructure. Now, payment is a real issue. That's what drives healthcare. But the United States is really good at providing healthcare at a very high level across the country, and that's something India needs to do. And the Public Health Foundation of India, which takes on a lot of the government programs here, it was done in partnership with the Gates Foundation and 13 U.S. medical schools and schools of public health in terms of developing the curriculum. But it's an entirely Indian organization, and I think those types of things are where the American infrastructure, institutions, capital, all of that can be very useful. And I think there's a lot of goodwill there, too, particularly because so many healthcare professionals are of Indian-American origin. So.
Another sort of area, sort of irritant in the relationship is the sort of niggling pressure from the US or from different stakeholders in the US that the Indian intellectual property rights regime is not a good one, it needs to be changed. The Indian assessment is that the Indian IPR laws are fully WTO compliant, and they are also socially necessary for a country like India. We would argue for the rest of the world in terms of making available at affordable prices, medications that people need to survive.
Right.
Why do we have this insistent pressure?
Right.
For us to change these laws which are WTO compliant.
Right. So I think you really have to separate on that who's doing it. This is really pressure from the Fortune 500 pharmaceutical industry to do this. That's where it's all coming from. So I think nobody's asked this specifically related to India, but in general, the U.S. population is very inclined to understand India's viewpoint about life-saving medications. So I think if you did a poll, I think the vast majority of Americans would say we understand India's position and we accept it. And in fact, in the United States, there's often outrage about the price of medications, right? So I don't think the American people have a problem with India's point of view. I think the pharmaceutical industry does for its own reasons, right? I think when you took at the broader issue of knowledge-based industries where IP is important, there you're still seeing a whole lot of investment in the tech sector. You're seeing a whole lot of investment in pharmaceutical and biotech into India. So I think, it's sort of a learn as you go amongst the emerging industries that India is a hotbed of talent, and no matter how difficult or easy it is a place to do business, this is where there's incredible talent and it needs to be resourced. So I think we have to separate out who is driving the political debate, and that's a small group of self-serving companies.
But they do have, but they do end up having a voice within the administration, right? When Prime Minister Modi went to DC, there was this announcement of setting up a joint working group to look at IPR issues. A question that we thought was settled because we have a law. What else is there to see, right? But so there is this sort of sense in which this may loom larger and adversely impact the life chances of millions of people.
But that's why I hope, and you're absolutely right. That's why I hope, whether it's the Indian American community or some other forces, that the conversation can be driven by more than just the Fortune 500, which is what drives the relationship right now. If you look at how much startup investment, if you look at how much philanthropy is going on, if you look at the way USAID is transforming itself, there's a lot of engagement for the United States and India that doesn't speak for that particular group of companies.
Now, I'm going to take advantage of your presence in the studio, move you away from your comfort zone slightly, or your technical comfort zone, and ask you a question about the upcoming elections.
Sure.
The lay of the land appears clear. So on the Republican side, you have Cruz, you have Trump. On the Democrat side, you have Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders. What's your sort of enlightened prediction about what will emerge from these two camps and eventually in the elections itself?
Well, so on the Democratic side, it looks like Hillary Clinton will be the nominee. It looks like she's doing, in fact, today is the New York primary in the United States, and looks like she'll win and she'll have the pathway to the delegates. On the Republican side, it still appears that Trump has the inside track. There's been lots of talk about in the U.S. we have the party convention system where the delegates vote the nominee, and there's still a good chance that Trump is either denied in his words or the rules don't favor him. And so there's a little bit more palace intrigue about what will happen on the Republicans. But if I was a betting man, it would be still Trump versus Clinton for the fall. And I'm a big supporter of Hillary Clinton. I worked in the Clinton administration, and so I think she's ultimately going to win and win pretty handily, actually. So.
And I know you don't speak for the community, Indian American community, as such, but since you are an Indian American, you probably have a sense of the pulse within. Where would you say the Indian Americans are leaning this time?
It is very, very pro Hillary Clinton, and I think that's because she's had now 25 years of relationships with Indian Americans. And so from the 92 campaign, I worked on the 96 campaign. That's when I got my start in politics. There's been Indian Americans involved. They did the first fundraiser, political fundraiser with Indian Americans. Clinton visited India, so, as did Hillary. And then, George W. Bush did a good job engaging Indian Americans. But then Hillary was senator from New York, which has a large community. So I think the vast majority of the community is very much in favor of Hillary Clinton. So.
And their preferences are important not because of the sheer numbers who vote, but because of the power of their checkbooks?
I think checkbooks as well as intellectual capital. I think the number of Indian Americans in really mission-critical roles in healthcare, technology, academia, international affairs is critical. And so having that community on your side is important to American candidates, most of them anyways. So.
Well, we have another 5 months to go, and we'll have by November have a clear view, obviously, on this. But
yes, exactly.
Nish Acharya, we'll have to leave it there.
Great.
Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Well, that wraps up this episode of IST. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.